I'm Denise, I'm the Scottish one.
And she's a non-fiction editor. And I'm Louise, the English one.
And she's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Editing Podcast. So we're delighted today to welcome another friend from across the pond, and this time it's editor Sea Chapman. And Sea is going to talk to us today about conlangs or constructed languages. So welcome, Sea.
Yes, welcome, Sea. Thanks so much for coming on. It's lovely to have you. So first of all, can you tell listeners a little about what you do and where you're from?
Yes, I've been an editor since 2006, and I've worked on a little bit of everything, but I've focused most of my efforts on editing creative writing over the last 6 or 7 years. And lately, I've been working as a technical editor by day and a fiction and games editor by night, because it's easier to pay the bills that way. So I'm also a language enthusiast, as most editors are, but beyond the world of our edibuddies, I'm also very involved with groups like the Death Positivity Movement and the conlang community, specifically the Language Creation Society. And I'm a baby conlanger by comparison to most other conlangers out there, but I love learning more and more about the creativity and thought that goes into language creation all the time.
That's great, See. I think to kick off, we should probably clarify first what we mean by a conlang, because some people might not have heard that term. So can you tell us what it means, and perhaps you could give us some examples? Actually, if you could speak a few words from a conlang, it would be great. I've been dying to ask that.
Me too. And the ruder the better.
Oh, I wish. One of my big struggles, so I have hearing loss, and I really struggle with some of the nuances with spoken language. And so that's one of my big hurdles as a conlanger. And so I actually look at a lot of signed conlangs, which are unusual, and written conlangs. Mm-hmm. I enjoy spoken conlangs, but I have a harder time grasping that.
Right.
Okay. So, but a constructed language is shortened to conlang in English, and it's an intentionally invented language. And I could go off on this all the time, so please tell me when you've had enough. But it's essentially a language that doesn't develop naturally amongst like a specific population or culture group over time. It is instead deliberately designed by one or more creators who have specific intents, purposes, and applications in mind for that invented language. And by contrast, a natural language, or a natlang, at least within the linguistic world, because natlang is also used differently within the conlanging community. A natlang to linguists is a language that developed organically over time, say on a specific continent or among specific peoples or culture groups. And natlangs include living languages, revived languages, and dead languages, as well as creoles and signed languages. Most conlangs attempt to mimic or blend facets of natlangs to come across as more natural and be easier to use.
You've talked a little bit about this already, but who's constructing these languages? Is it linguists? And perhaps you can talk a little about the depth involved, because it's not. I think when I first came across this stuff, I thought it was maybe just transposing individual words, but sometimes is there an entire grammar involved, or are there different types of conlangs, so some of which are fuller or more complex than others?
Oh, definitely. So when you talked about transposing, that relates more to like ciphers and codes, and those aren't the same things as conlangs. Ciphers and codes rely on a natural language, an existing language in the real world, to give the cipher code meaning, and there is usually a specific pattern or formula that helps convert a natural language into a code or a cipher and back again. And they're meant to hide information from outsiders, while conlangs are not always created with that same intention. And while there are more and more linguists getting involved with conlang creation, especially graduate students studying linguistics, many conlangers are hobbyists with a just incredible breadth and depth of linguistic knowledge. I mean, some of these hobbyists have an understanding of linguistics that rivals many professional linguists.
Wow.
That's
so might it be someone, for example, who's really into Star Trek, but they also have that? I mean, is that like one example? So someone who's really into a particular sort of made up or fictional culture, and then kind of develops and expands on sort of some of the stuff that's already been done.
Yes. I mean, when we talk about, so Klingon's a fictional language, and fictional languages, there's so many different kinds of conlangs. Fictional languages are one, and sometimes they're called auxlangs or artlangs, depending on how they're being used.
Okay.
And fictional languages essentially are intended to be as realistic and natural sounding and functioning as possible so that the fictional language can be portrayed as a natural language within a fictional setting. And that enhances believability for world building. So Klingon specifically plays the role of a natural language within the fictional world of Star Trek, but outside of Star Trek, it's just a conlang. And so real languages include any working language in the real world, which includes both natlangs and conlangs, but a fake language is superficial, and it's usually restricted to a handful of sounds or a string of sounds meant to imply real language where there isn't one. And like a language like Dothraki, the way that existed in the original books that the Game of Thrones series is inspired by, it's a sketch lang. It's a fragment. It's incomplete. There's no grammar and syntax like you mentioned. A conlang is a functional language that you could hold a conversation in.
Right.
It's a minefield, isn't it?
Yeah. And so they had to hire someone to flesh out these, inconsistent little bits of nonsense from the books into an actual language, and that's what linguist David J. Peterson did with the Dothraki, High Valyrian, and everything else. He actually is a part of the Language Creation Society community, and he found that job through the job board for the LCS.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's easier in, from what I think you're saying, is it's easier in written language to just have fragments of it if somebody is writing a novel or something, but that's not a true conlang because it's not a functioning language. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So I think that's where I'm most familiar with this sort of concept is in like science fiction and fantasy books, TV shows and that sort of thing. So if we're thinking about our listeners, our independent authors who might be writing in those genres and want to include a conlang or a sketchlang or whatever the actual correct term would be for it, should they even try doing it on their own? Is it feasible for somebody to create something from scratch?
It is feasible, but you have to go into conlang creation understanding the commitment involved.
Yeah.
That's
I'm getting that.
Yeah, I know. I think when we started this conversation, I hadn't quite realised that, but now it's a whole bigger thing.
Yeah. One of the difficult parts with conlang creation is you have to have a really solid grasp on linguistics, and if you don't, you must learn it. And so having to teach yourself linguistics on your own and then kind of muddle through and create this horrible Frankenlang, which is a term for a really nonsensical pieced together language, that's kind of what most people do when they first create a conlang, is they create something that's just horrible, and other conlangers will try to be polite and say, oh, this is nice and this is nice, and then they will just rip the rest to shreds. And they're trying to be helpful, but it can be really harsh and really intimidating because it is so complex. And it's not to say that a writer shouldn't try to write a conlang. It just takes a lot of practice and a lot of time. And I mean, usually when I encounter conlangs in fiction, what happened was I had a conlanger who had built this whole world around a language and built this series story Bible, and they wanted to edit the first book in that series, and this was a monstrosity. It was like 300,000 words.
Oh wow.
And conlangers are very, very committed to world building for their languages when it's something where they want to have like a history behind it, when they want to have a proto-lang, and have child languages and everything branch out from that and cultures tied to it. So authors who aren't wanting to become dedicated conlangers, by all means, go ahead and look at creating a sketch lang, and there's ways to do that where you focus on like maybe one or two phrases and then a handful of words, but I wouldn't push it much more than that. You do want to have a basic understanding of like subject, verb, object, word order, and how you're using that. You want to pay attention to if you're making it hard for readers. If you're using like a string of consonants and they can't pronounce it, they're going to look at this word that has XZTSBL, and they're just going to go, oh, that's the X word again.
Yeah.
And they're not going to know what it is.
That's a really interesting point, actually, because I think I've come across a similar problem, but in a very different context. And when I'm editing and words come up in a foreign real language, foreign to me, and if I don't know how to pronounce that word, then it immediately has less meaning for me, and I just struggle over it, and it actually pulls me out of the narrative. And that's happened in non-fiction work as well. And so thinking about it from the reader's point of view, there is the potential to cause readers to trip, and then it becomes actually something that's not enriching the book anymore. It's actually
exactly,
kind of throwing readers out. That kind of moves on to my next question, which was going to be, if you just want to include a few words here and there rather than going for this fuller, deeper construction. You've already hinted at some of the rules that an author might have to think about, but what about tools that writers could use so they don't get in a pickle? So I'm thinking about how the author could help an editor keep track of the sketchlang, or the even if it's just something that's quite just the vocabulary and any grammatical rules that they've tried to construct.
Usually, if they're a conlanger, like a tried and true conlanger, they're going to have a dictionary and a grammar that they've written. That is very typical.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If it's an author who's just wanting to add a sketchlang into their fiction, the best thing to do, actually, as an editor, as long as you're contracted with them and you're comfortable with it, or whatever circumstances feel best to you, giving them a blank style sheet and encouraging them to fill out everything with words, and then adding notes about grammar, syntax, or phrases.
Yeah.
I think it's the best way to help them help you.
Yes.
Is by letting them really collaborate on the style sheet with you.
Okay.
That's going to make it easier for you as an editor, and it's going to make it easier for them to communicate with you about what they want it to be, what their vision for that language is within the greater story.
Yeah.
See, can I just ask quickly? This is a kind of more practical question, but if someone's editing with an author with quite an extensive vocabulary of constructed words, I mean, does that slow you down? Is that going to incur extra costs for the author because the editor has to take more time to look out for this kind of stuff? Is that something you would build into a quotation? Is that something that authors need to think about, or is it just kind of business as usual?
The reality is, I don't really know many editors that deal with conlangs at the level that I do.
Yeah,
right.
I don't. And so it's not something that I necessarily charge extra for. It's just I treat it as one of many factors, specifically complexity is what I'm considering with that. And for me, the biggest thing is I will usually do, a quick skim over a manuscript, and I'll tell authors, I'm seeing that you're including a lot of the conlang and like a special script that's not even Roman type.
Oh gosh,
and
right. Yeah.
I can't read it. I don't see any translations anywhere for it. And until you can include translations and probably trim out maybe, a third of it or a half of it from the overall text, this isn't going to be a manuscript that you can publish for, a wider audience than just yourself.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's where somebody's got really caught up in it and has just written so much in it that it's actually it's blocking almost the ability of somebody else to engage with the story because there's just too much of it. Is that right?
Yes. And
Yeah.
actually, interesting tidbit. So J.R.R. Tolkien, his books were all created specifically as a vehicle for conlangs he had created. He didn't write the books first and then create the conlangs. He created the conlangs first. And while in the past, like in the 17th century and everything, even, 19th century, creating constructed languages, which were back then philosophical language, was meant to perfect language and improve it, and it was an intellectual pursuit. By the time, that Tolkien was creating these languages, it was viewed more as kind of a idle mind is a devil's workshop type of thing. Like, who would do this? Why would you do it? It's a waste of time.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote his books to justify how he spent his
Wow.
time.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and so a lot of conlangers it's not to justify their conlangs, but they find joy in creating these worlds and these stories and these characters that give their conlangs life.
Right. So
And so, yeah.
yeah. So the stories are a vehicle for the language that they've created.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
that's a very different thing than an author who's like, I want to have an alien language because there's an alien in this scene.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Get that.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Great. See, if I could just ask about the sort of basic sort of rookie errors that you might see with your authors who are attempting to use a conlang or a sketchlang. Where do people tend to come unstuck when they try this, but they've not really got any experience of it? Are there common errors?
Yeah, the most common is one that I mentioned earlier, where they're making the words unpronounceable,
Right. Yeah.
or even they create their own special script that's not, again, in an alphabet that the reader's familiar with,
Mm.
or a syllabary that the reader's familiar with, depending on what audience we're talking about. But that's one of the biggest problems. The other problem is when they're not including translations. And so we just see a string of words that are foreign to us. We don't know what they mean. And it's supposed to be important in a scene. A good example, and this is one that I've made up, but it's one that I use to show authors where there are problems, is let's say that you have a scene where a character is held hostage by some sort of alien creature that doesn't speak the captive's language. And they're speaking to another creature, and the captive has no idea what they're saying. And we don't ever get to flip around to the creature's perspective, so we don't get a translation of what's happening.
Right.
And we just see this string of words, this conversation happening where the captive's completely excluded. The only way that this works is if we're trying to make it obvious and apparent how distanced and excluded that person is. But you don't want to do it for too long or too many sentences. Often the best thing to do is maybe have one sentence and they continued talking in this tongue that she did not understand.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's enough,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Otherwise, it is just it kind of overworks the point that the reader, as well as the viewpoint character, don't know what's going on, and we don't need to be told that too often.
And you don't know as a reader is this important? Am I supposed to be understanding from this somehow what they're saying, or am I meant to infer something? I suppose it would cause me to stop really if there was a conversation going on in a language that I had no translation for.
Well, it's a bit like, I mean, even just thinking about it in the real world terms, if I'm sitting at a table with two people and they swap into a real language that they both speak but I don't, okay, so for a few minutes I'll think that's their thing. But if that conversation goes on for too long, then it becomes obvious that I'm not welcome here, and I'm not part of that conversation, and so I'm going to move elsewhere. And you don't want your readers doing that.
Exactly.
So see, are there any existing common languages that you've kind of answered this, but when we first started talking, but it would be nice for listeners and for me and perhaps Denise to just really nail it, because it is such a much more complex area than maybe a lot of people will realize. Are there existing common languages that conlangs or sketchlangs are typically based on? And is there a difference? I mean, when people are sort of looking to borrow from existing languages, does where people live, does that come into play at all? Are certain people in particular regions or countries more likely to swing towards certain language, or at least towards particular common languages with particular tonal sounds? Does any of that make sense?
Yeah. So a lot of conlangers tend to focus on specific linguistic elements for their languages rather than recreating an existing language.
Yeah. Okay.
So one conlanger I know avoided vowels in his conlang entirely, and he managed to pull it off. It was incredible.
Wow.
While another wanted to focus his phonology on unvoiced consonants. And so that said, I've encountered several Western conlangers specifically trying to reinvent Japanese.
Right.
I don't know why that seems
Yeah.
to be a thing. And they're usually like white male fans of anime.
Oh gosh,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
okay.
So, and I mean, I love anime, so that's part of the reason why I'm aware that's a thing. It's just interesting because that's really the most common reinvention of language that I encounter. But I will say that most people tend to try to borrow from languages that are either extremely different than their own. So an English-speaking conlanger will try to borrow from, Navajo and Swahili and
Mm.
Mhm.
Cantonese, while you may have an Italian conlanger who is borrowing from French and Portuguese and Spanish, and it's all very close to their own language, but it's easier for them to do for their first conlang.
Right.
Right.
People either are overly ambitious with their first conlang or try to play it safe.
Mhm.
People in the conlang community tend to go to extremes. I don't really see people in the middle. It's
Yeah.
Right.
either I'm going to try all the very difficult, complex things, or I'm going to play it safe and stick with languages that are similar to my own.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
That's really interesting.
I'm finding this whole concept absolutely
I
fascinating. I mean,
know,
I,
I
I
know.
knew.
We could talk all day, couldn't we,
Yeah,
about this
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, so see, we've touched on already about the idea that an author or a creator of a conlang should help an editor as much as possible by filling out a comprehensive style sheet with instructions on grammar and syntax and things like that. From the editor's point of view, once you're presented with a manuscript that has a conlang in it, are there particular things that the editor should be looking out for beyond consistency of spelling and that sort of thing, or the defined syntax and grammar? Are there any sort of things that you find that you tend to pick up that the writer has overlooked?
Often it's overuse of the
Right,
conlang, um,
right.
and also using it in scenes where it serves no real purpose. There's no meaning for it to be there.
Hmm. Hmm.
So if we have it where two people are speaking in an alien tongue that is not English, and we're addressing an English-speaking audience in the text, mentioning that they're speaking in the alien tongue is fine. Having to have a whole page of a conversation with a translation,
Yeah.
it
Right,
you
yeah.
know,
It just
um,
becomes ink on the page, doesn't it?
it does, and it that can be really frustrating for readers. And so one of the big things when editing a conlang within a novel, within a manuscript, is looking out for the reader, looking
Hmm.
at it and saying, is this going to overwhelm the reader? Is this going to help the reader? Is this going to help with world building or character development? And paying attention to that reader perspective, and always keeping that at the forefront, because while you want to help your author with their creative pursuits with language here, the goal of their book should really be forefront, and addressing the correct readers needs to happen.
That's a really, really useful point. See, and I'm wondering from that, would you recommend then if somebody has written with a conlang that they should get something like a manuscript critique or involve a developmental editor at some point rather than going straight to line editing, even if they think they've got their structure sorted and what have you? Do you think there's value in them having it critiqued by somebody to just check for those sort of
It's
things?
almost like a type of sensitivity reading you're
Yeah.
Yeah,
suggesting. That's a
well,
really good point.
definitely. And I think that a manuscript critique is helpful.
Hmm.
Um, I also feel like it would be good for them to look to some of the conlang communities out there, which I'll touch on that in a minute,
Hmm.
more specifically. But if they reach out to conlangers who have experience and say, hey, I've included these lines of a sketchlang in my novel, and here's the rules that I've developed for it and kind of some background. What do you think? And they'll get some critiques back that will be really helpful.
Right. Hmm.
Um, and from the editorial side, a manuscript critique is good. Developmental editing is a must, I think,
Yep.
when you involve a conlang, um, because you really need to look at it from both the macro perspective and the micro perspective, paying attention to not only how it influences the story, but how it influences a specific scene, um, and incorporating in a way so it flows smoothly. Not
Hmm.
not necessarily smooth writing, because that's line editing later,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but making the story flow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great advice. So kind of following on from that, are there any particular resources that you can recommend for authors or editors who want to dig deeper into constructed languages?
Oh, definitely. So the Language Creation Society's website is conlang.org,
Hmm.
and it's an amazing resource. There's a conlangers library on there. There's so many things on there that people can use, and the LCS community is one that we can all learn from or turn to for help. They're really welcoming. And there's conlanging groups elsewhere online too, like the conlang subreddit or the constructed languages group on Facebook, or even the con workshop forum. And there's podcasts, Linguifex and Conlangery and more. So those are all good places to start.
That sounds great,
Right.
because if somebody's new to writing science fiction or fantasy, and they're thinking that they might want to include a sketchlang or a conlang, they might even not be familiar with those terms. It's great to be able to point them in the right direction and say, realize what you're getting into, I
Yeah,
think
Yeah.
would be the big thing. So
definitely.
we'll definitely link to those and make sure that everything that you've mentioned is in the show notes. See, that's
And
been
if
really, really useful. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and if I have a handout that I made for it, I gave a presentation on conlangs at the ACES conference in 2018,
Yeah.
and if anyone wants a copy of that, they're free to contact me, and I'm happy to send that off. It's quite large, so it's probably easier if I get a
Okay.
link together for that.
That's
Great.
fantastic.
That'd be really good. Thank you so much. See, that's brilliant.
Really interesting, See.
Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you both.
You're very welcome. So pleased to have you here. It's been great. So now it's time for Editing Bites, which is our regular feature where we recommend a tool or a resource to help you on your writing journey. We've already had loads from C today.
Right.
People have got a lot of homework to do on
Yeah.
conlangs now. But Louise, what have you got for us this week?
Something with a little more light relief. So mine is a free 45-minute webinar in which the wonderful Ian Banks talks to the Open University about how he builds planning into the overall writing process, how world events have impacted on his writing, about genre and the impact on sales and reader accessibility, and about the digitization of his books. I love Banks's stuff, and the sci-fi and the weirdy contemporary fiction that he
Yeah.
and in this webinar it just comes across he's really listenable, down to earth, thoughtful, quite funny at times, but overall he just gives really good interview. No conlang words in this, but or sketchlang, or whatever the right terminology is, but I read that series, that culture series, eons ago, and so I searched it up when I knew we were going to be chatting about this, and he has well, I don't know, maybe it is a conlang, or maybe it's a different it's got a different tag to it, but I think it's
Yeah.
called Moraine, and
Mhm.
and that's got its own font too. So I'll stick the links to that
Right.
webinar in the show notes,
Very cool.
and to the language.
Brilliant, great. Well, my bite is a book that I learned about just yesterday when I was listening to the Illusionist podcast in the car, a previous episode of it. It's a book by Paul Baker, who's a professor of English language at Lancaster University here in the UK, and it's called Fabulosa, The Story of Polari, Britain's Secret Gay Language. I don't know, are you familiar with Polari at all? See? Yes.
It's so great.
It's great, isn't it? Now, it's not a conlang. It's like
It's
like
a secret language
a
for
secret
gay
language.
men
Yeah,
back in the
that's
day.
it.
Yeah.
So it's a secret, informal way of identifying and communicating within a specific group. So in this case, it's mainly gay men, but also people in theatre have used it a lot as well. And it was used at a time when being gay was a criminal offence. My personal knowledge of Polari is from the BBC radio comedy of the 1960s, Round the Horn, which had characters Julian and Sandy in it who used elements of Polari. And they would say things like, "Oh, how bona to vada your dolly old eek," and things like that. So
That sounds so good with a Scottish accent as well.
it's even better if you can imagine it with Kenneth Williams saying it. In fact, I
Ooh.
think we should put a link in the show notes to a little clip from Round the
Yeah,
Horn of him talking
Definitely,
about it.
definitely.
So if you're interested in learning more about Polari, this should be well worth the read. And there's a website of the research that Paul Baker has done as well. But it's a lovely, interesting aspect of language.
That's fantastic.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So that's it. See, a massive thank you for a really entertaining episode. That was brilliant. And
Thank you both.
you're very welcome. It was so lovely to have you. And to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this as much as we have. Thank you for tuning into the Editing Podcast. You can rate, review, and subscribe to us via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever platform you prefer.
And we'll put all the links to everything we've mentioned in the show notes so you can grab everything there. Thank you once again, C, for being an amazing guest.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.